Hi, I'm Jody. I'm here with Kate Winkler Dawson. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for coming here.
And we're going to be talking about Kate's new book, and it's called Death in the Air.
That's right.
Yes, and so I'm super excited to hear about it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Yeah, I'm really happy to talk to you about it. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then we can talk about the book.
Great.
So I am a native Texan through and through. And I was growing up here, and my father was a law professor at the University of Texas for 37 years, criminal law. So I spent a lot of my life going to law school classes, hearing about court cases, and learning about criminals and crime. And that's really where I sort of fell in love with the idea of true crime and true crime history. And so that was really a nice relationship that I built with my father, and it, created a nice bond with us. And so years later, when I decided I wanted to start writing, that's really what I pulled from, was that experience with him. So a little bit more about my background. I'm a journalism professor at the University of Texas, kind of specialized in broadcast journalism. So I was at WCBS in New York and Fox News Channel, and a bunch of really great places. And so I learned a lot about journalism and a lot about writing and a lot about how to tell a story visually. And so I'm really attracted to visual stories. And this book for me is a very visual story. So let me tell you about the book.
Yeah, I know it's a nonfiction book.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd love to hear more about the book.
Okay, so this is a book about an event that now a lot more people know about. It's called The Great Smog of 1952, London's Great Smog of 1952. And it was a weather occurrence that happened in December of 1952, where an anticyclone, which is a high-pressure weather system, landed over London and created a lid over the city. So it trapped all of the air, the warm air from coming out, and it trapped all of the pollution for 5 days over the city. And at the time, London was the most polluted city, essentially, in the world, because it was the most populated, the most industrialized. And it was right after World War II, 4 years after World War II. And so there was a lot of pollution in the air, a lot of deadly toxins from a lot of different sources. So over 5 days, more than 8 million Londoners breathed in horrible, deadly smog, and they couldn't get away from it. And so this book is about several characters who are caught in the smog, and one of them is a serial killer. So that is sort of the quick and dirty wrap-up of Death in the Air.
Okay, so what inspired you to, write this book?
Well, I think when you're looking for a book to write, and you are a journalist and you're interested in writing narrative nonfiction. So narrative nonfiction is nonfiction that's written like fiction. So you have to have all of these amazing elements. You have to have visuals that you can evoke for an audience, and smells and tastes, and really rich characters. And it has to be at a time in history that people want to read about, in a city that people want to read about. And so when I was looking, I was doing what I always do, which was just sort of skimming around the internet, reading everything I possibly could. And I ran across this date in December, and I looked up a little bit more, and I found out about the Great Smog. And the descriptions were interesting, for sure. Of course, people choking, and you weren't able to see, and it's this yellow film, and the smells. But when I saw the pictures, that's where it just all came together for me. And I could just see how frightening it must have been, like being in the smoke of a forest fire and not being able to get out, and just being surrounded by this smoke, and you can't get it off your skin, and you can't get it out of your lungs, and it's just burning you, and it's burning the inside of your nose and in your eyes, and going inside your house doesn't stop it because it's coming through the windows. And so when I was watching some footage that I found that just showed how pervasive this smoke was. I just realized this is an amazing story. I can't believe no one's told this story before. And I wanted to be the one who told the story.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So why did the fog and the serial killer storylines work so well together?
So I'll tell you a little bit about the serial killer.
Okay.
Okay, so as we said, this is about the Great Smog of 1952, and it's 5 days of just a horrible calamity that's hit London. People can't see, they are sick, they have bronchitis and dying in beds, and it's a time when Londoners should be sort of coming together and supporting each other, and we do have those characters. There's a little girl whose father dies in the middle of the smog. There's a doctor, there's a police officer. These are kind of the helpers of society in London. And then there's John Reginald Christie, who in the UK is a fairly well-known serial killer. And during the smog, is one of the characters. And what's interesting about his storyline in this book is that at first the fog and the serial killer are running side by side, right? So the fog is happening, and John Reginald Christie, the serial killer who hadn't killed anyone for at least 4 years, is stuck in this fog, and his wife writes about it. He's stuck in his apartment with her. He had killed 2 women several years earlier. They're buried in his backyard. No one knows anything about it.
Did his wife know about it?
Nope.
Nope, she didn't.
No, and she later became a victim.
Okay.
So you have these incredible images of his garden in Notting Hill, which Notting Hill now is pretty posh. Notting Hill in the 1950s was a pretty horrible place to live. It was really poor, dilapidated buildings, not enough police, far too many criminals. And so he was actually kind of an upstanding citizen in this hellhole. And so in this little back garden of this tenement where he lived with his wife on the ground floor, a very quiet couple, he had 2 women buried in the back for years and nobody knew. So when this fog came in, you have these really eerie images of the fog covering up the things that, he has buried. And the images, I think, at the beginning of the book for me that are the most powerful is the idea of 2 stranglers on the loose. So that's what Christie's motive was, is he strangled all of his victims. And actually he used coal gas to kill several of them, which was a very strange thing. But he convinced several women to inhale coal gas that came from the tap of his heater, and it disabled them and he killed them. So it was sort of an accomplice of his. But in the fog, during the fog of 1952, in December, he was just another Londoner struggling to get through this fog. He was also planning to kill his next victim during the fog. He went out in the middle of the fog and resigned his job. And he had made a decision that moving forward, he was not going to live life with his wife any longer. And so just a few days after the fog, he strangled and killed her. So after the fog, we have this serial killer who is now living by himself as the fog is being debated in Parliament, and are there deaths and aren't there deaths, and who's the cause, and pollution can't be the cause, but it is the cause. John Christie is killing more women. And finally these stories converge about 6 months later when John Christie, the serial killer, kills 3 more women, puts them all over his house. He wallpapers 3 of them into the alcove of his kitchen, and then he goes on the run. And the media go crazy. He is a celebrity murderer. He is front page news, and the fog essentially disappears from the newspapers. And it is like that for 6 to 9 months. And, John Christie, the serial killer, is not the only reason why the media and Parliament and the public seem to lose interest in the fog. But it was a very, very clear example of what can happen when a sensationalized story very quickly usurps something that is a bigger deal because this fog killed 12,000 people. He killed 6, maybe 8. So why do we care more about someone who killed 6 or 8 people versus, this essentially a predator who killed 12,000?
Wow. And what's the background on John Christie?
Quiet and unassuming. Like, aren't they all? Serial killers. Quiet and unassuming, awkward, trouble with women. I mean, he was very, very smart, which is not that's also a pretty common trait with many serial killers. He was not particularly smart about how he covered up his murders, but intelligence. He was very intelligent. So he worked for the government. He was an invoice clerk with a transportation company. He had been married for several decades to the same kind of dowdy woman. He was awkward and not particularly good looking. When he was younger, he had some issues with women where they publicly embarrassed him about his performance, and it created an awful lot of insecurity. And then to really top it off, he was gassed in World War I with mustard gas and lost a good portion of his voice. Oh, wow. So he ended up with this sort of squeak that I'm sure was not particularly attractive to most women. So, all of this puts together a profile of a very awkward, insecure, angry man who found out that he likes controlling women and killing them. And he wasn't stopped, and it took a long time to stop him. So it was a way of him acting out not appropriately, and finally, he just ran out of options, and he ended up leaving and going on the run. So this is what's funny, that it's not funny about his life, but one of the more interesting things about his life is I think he was honestly at his happiest when he was finally given this notoriety that he had been looking for. I mean, no joke, the papers just led every day with where is John Christie, or the murder house, or more bodies, and that's how I found out about him. I spent probably 2 months trying to find articles or information on the fog in London and New York newspapers, and I could not get away from those stories about Christie, about the serial killer, the Moonlight Killer, and murder house, and how many more victims are there, and a bloody mess. Well, there was no blood. He strangled everybody. So there's so much misinformation. It created such a frenzy that for me, even 63 years later, trying to do research on this book was difficult. I couldn't find the stories about the fog because I couldn't get away from Christie. And so, I think that he created this character of who he was. He wanted to be this sort of, man who could take control and, be attractive to women. And he turned into the celebrity that he really wanted to be. Wow.
So do you have an excerpt that you want to read about him?
Yes. So this is a little segment that I think just, for me, shows just how callous he really was. This is about John Christie, and this is after his second victim. So he's describing how he buried her. This is
and this is before the fog.
This is before the fog.
Okay.
So he has put this woman under the floorboards, and now he's thinking of moving her. So he took up the floorboards and carried Ruth into his tenement gardens wash house, a small building with a sink mostly used for storage, but rarely by the other tenants. Late that night, around 10 o'clock, he told his wife he needed to use the lavatory, another small building in the garden near the wash house. He walked outside and quickly took his shovel. Nobody watched me as I continued digging through the ground until they came outside. Then they nodded Cheerios to me, he said. When they left, he dragged Ruth from the wash house and rolled her into the grave. In 1952, so this is the fog. 1952, 9 years later, she was still there, secluded by the fog, just another object planted in the garden. His garden. She was lying beneath him many days. The war constable, with the large forehead, thinning hair, and startling voice, frequently dragged a rake less than 2 feet above her. His steps disturbed the dirt. He shoved plants into the ground just inches from her face. He fancied himself a talented gardener. One day he was digging and misjudged where he had buried her, thrusting his shovel through her neck, cracking part of her vertebrae and breaking off her skull. He picked up her head and tossed it into an old dustbin for burning. He didn't have an innate process, the perfect way to murder someone, not yet. In December 1952, the fog dragged above Ruth First, brushing over the dead leaves lying on the ground. It was a ghastly final resting place for a troubled young woman. Even more alarming, she wasn't alone.
Wow, thanks for reading that.
Thank you.
Well, let's move on to talking about what causes deadly 5-day-long smog, and then talking about how the Londoners lived through it.
Yeah, so the smog was a perfect storm. It was really fascinating the way it happened, actually. So we talked about this anticyclone, this weather version that came and put a lid over the city. So air wasn't able to, the pollution that would normally been able to be released into the atmosphere was trapped for 5 days. And normally a little wind would come in, move the anticyclone away, and then, you know, the pollution would be able to be set free. And that just didn't happen this time. So there was a lot of pollution from many different sources. The number one was in post-war London, Winston Churchill's government was bankrupt because of the war. And so the main fuel was coal. And Britain had to sell its quote-unquote clean coal, so the black coal that had the high carbon content that burned more efficiently. They sold it overseas. And the Londoners had to burn the brown, soft, sooty coal. So they called it nutty slack. And it was mostly brown dust with little tiny bits of nuts of coal. And it was about a quarter less effective than black coal. So you would have to burn 4 times the amount of nutty slack in order to create the same heat as, you know, a small amount of coal. So you can imagine how much, right, you can imagine how much they have to burn. And in December, when the smog started, it was some of the coldest days of the year. So you've got 8 million people in a very small area burning really cheap coal. Just a few days before the smog started, the British government released the rations on nutty slack. So you could now run out and buy as much as you wanted. It wasn't rationed. And all of this burning of brown, nasty, dirty coal created smoke. And it sent sulfur dioxide into the air. It sent smoke particles into the air, other chemicals into the air. So that's bad enough. The city also had 40 power plants that were all fueled by coal. It also had 20,000 in England, 20,000 steam-powered locomotives, all fueled by coal.
Wow, and they're all fueled by this
nasty coal.
Wow.
Yes, and then on top of that, this is the most ironic part for me. So London used to have a really effective electric tram system. Those are one of the main transportation systems. That summer, 1952, right before the smog, they discontinued the tram system and replaced it with those beautiful red double-decker buses, you know, people like us, that are fueled with diesel. And so, of course, that emitted toxins into the air. So it was literally a perfect storm of pollution happening during these 5 days. And as I said, any other time, this anticyclone would have blown away within, 12 to 36 hours. This one stayed 5 days. There was no wind. And so you're talking about clouds of yellow, disgusting, smelly, thick, burning fog that you can't see through. And the police officer is one of my favorite characters in the book. Stanley Critchen would tell me, you could put your hand out and your hand would disappear, and then slowly your arm would disappear, and pretty soon you would just be up to your elbow. They said it was like walking through clouds. You would cut off at your knees.
Wow.
And so you can imagine as a police officer what it must have been like to try to govern and, to take control of criminals and not be able to see anybody around you. It was terrifying for many people.
Now, can you talk a little bit about more of the characters? You have the police officer, the serial killer, and you mentioned a few more.
Yeah. So I do. I have Stanley, who is a police officer, who's a very young police officer in North London, and he's married to a woman who has chronic asthma. She's a nurse. They're both very young, and he's forced to leave her in the middle of the smog because he has to go on shift, and he's responsible for this particular beat, this particular area of North London, and he has to go, and she's choking and wheezing in their tiny little apartment in North London, and so he talks a lot through this. You find the character who encounters criminals and really spends quite a lot of time going into buildings and finding dead people. Because that's the reality of this smog, was there were not bodies strewn about the streets. This wasn't a flood. This wasn't a massive car wreck. These are people who died many times alone in their bedrooms, sometimes quietly, sometimes not, or in the hospitals. And so it was an awful long time before people in London knew that so many people had died. Most people didn't know. The coroners knew somewhat, but there was not communication. There was no computer system where they could communicate between each other. It was really the florists and the morticians who knew, because they were running out of plots and they were running out of burial wreaths. And then the government started rolling out the numbers on how many people died, and it was just a stunning number. But the other characters, I think the one I'm most attached to is, she's now a grandmother in London, but at the time when this story takes place, Rosemary was a 13-year-old, and she adored her father, who was away for the war. He came back, and he had always had chronic bronchitis, which many people in London did. I mean, you're living in a very polluted city, not having the best health. And quite honestly, up to 80% of the people in London smoked at the time, which didn't help.
Right.
So, and he did. So he worked for a bus company, and the first night of the smog, all the buses shut down, so he had to walk home. And it was 2 hours through the smog. And he got home and essentially collapsed. And then, you'll have to see what happens in the book, but she essentially, is trying to fight to save her father's life. And it's a pretty sad, difficult story. And then I have a doctor who later became a pretty famous doctor, but at the time he was a young doctor who was trying to save lives in the hospital. And then another one of my favorites is a politician named Norman Dodds, who is not particularly involved with the fog. His involvement comes after the fog. So he, like all of the Londoners, was affected by it, but he took up the cause of clean air, and I don't think this was something he particularly expected to do. This wasn't anything he was known for, but he was really the one who continued to go Winston Churchill's government into taking some action and making some change. And he was a pretty extraordinary man with a very big mouth, and he was very brash and outspoken and aggressive. And I think at the time, when you're dealing with a government who is desperate, that is what you need, is that sort of voice to come in and demand a change. And he was able to get it, which is wonderful. And then, yes, of course, we have the serial killer.
Well, I loved hearing all about your characters. So talk about how long this took to research.
Years for me. I would say anywhere between 2 or 3 years. I tend to, with books, have a whole little file of ideas, and I'll pick one up and put it away, and I'll do some more research and put that one away. And so this is kind of dragged out for, I would say, 3 to 4 years total, from when I've had the idea at the beginning to when I've been able to develop it. But I went to London, and sat in the National Archives, which is very much like our archives here. And it was a really incredible experience because there are thousands of documents that no one has ever seen or bothered to look at that I've seen. Internal government memos between Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Housing, and just papers and some of the things that government officials said. There's an internal memo that essentially says, well, they were all old, the smog victims were going to die anyway at some point. So, and to read sort of, to me, extraordinary statements like that about the callousness of a government is really extraordinary. And it's important, I think, as a writer, as an author especially, to just be able to touch all that stuff, to be in the neighborhoods. It's a little cheesy, I think, but it was very important for me to go during the time period, which was December 5th through December 10th. I really wanted to be in London. I know the air quality is different. I know the streets are somewhat different, but I wanted that feeling of what it was like, what the air might be like, how cold it might be, because visuals are so important to me. I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I had to be able to really write to that stuff. So that was an important part of the research. And I always go on a Jack the Ripper tour every time I'm in London. Always go to a Jack the Ripper tour. So that really helped too.
Yeah, I haven't been on one of those yet.
They're fabulous. Oh, they're so good. The autopsy photos or the crime scene photos are a little difficult to see. But anyway, so I think that it's important to feel a city and feel, like the history of it and the buildings, and to know that I walked where John Reginald Christie walked, or I've been to the hospital where, Stanley Christian's wife worked, and those are all very important things to me. And I think they are to most authors.
Now, what do you hope the readers take away after reading your book?
I think there are several things. I think clearly, this is a book about our environment, about pollution. It's a very extreme case of what can happen and what has happened when we have industries working in excess and creating as much pollution that's unregulated or poorly regulated. And I think that is, of course, a particular concern. I think in most countries. And I think that it's important, certainly, just even moving away from air pollution, to just remember whatever the important issue is, that it can be threatened for us to overlook if we're distracted by other headlines that are, silly, or, political infighting, or, salacious stories. It's so easy to be distracted away from the stories that really do matter, like our air quality, or crime, or there's so many different issues. But I do think that we get redirected quite a bit in all countries, not just the United States. So I think it's just a reminder that there are John Reginald Christie stories out there that will distract us from great smog issues, and we have them all in every country.
No, I think that's a really good point. You said, was it over 12,000 people?
Yeah, just about 12,000 people. That's the world's deadliest air pollution disaster, and most people don't know anything about it. And when most people found out about it was with The Crown, which was a very popular, series on Netflix, and it was an episode in The Crown, and the episode was inaccurate, but that's okay, because I was, to a certain extent, very happy that people even knew what was happening, because no one had heard of it. And many people in London had never heard of the smog. A lot of people knew about Christie, but not the smog. It's not a serial killer. It's not lava flowing down and, killing people. It's not dramatic. It is dramatic to the people in this book, and the scenes in this book are dramatic. But just seeing the footage of people coughing on BBC, I could see why people would just say, well, that's what you get for living in London, go somewhere else. Well, I think, people deserve more than that.
Yeah, well, that's really inspiring for you to be able to share this story.
Oh, yeah, incredibly. I'm so grateful that I was the one who was able to do this book because I think it's important. You know, there was a similar instance of this happening 4 years earlier in 1948 in Denora, Pennsylvania. 20 people died, and there's a museum there, and that's wonderful. There's nothing like that in London with almost 12,000 people. So I feel like it's important to really be able to honor the people who died, because it was a horrible way to die.
Yeah, that sounds horrible. So there is a book called The Devil in the White City. Yeah. And I know it was, people will compare your book to this book because it's a bestseller. Is that right? Yeah. Yes. So what do you say to people when they ask you the difference between your book compared to this book?
Well, I'm honored because, I mean, The Devil in the White City is one of my most favorite books. It really is. It's by Eric Larson, and it's essentially a parallel stories, a braided narrative, which is the same thing as this book, of turn of the century serial killer in Chicago while the World's Fair is being erected. And I think it's a great story. I think that the braided narrative, which is the idea of two stories sort of running parallel and then intersecting at a point, I think is a really powerful story. I think it's a way, I think, you know, for me especially too, I love being able to tell two stories about two major events that happened in the same time period. And I think it's very important to then be able to later on put them into context and say, why were they important? How were they related? How did they affect each other? And so I think, of course, Eric Larson did it brilliantly. And, you know, I hope that people have that same sort of reaction with this book, because I think it's incredibly important to know that, you know, there are different killers out there, and they affect one another, and how we react to one is different than how we might react to another. And what does that say about us as a society if we're more scared of a serial killer than we are of horrible, dirty, deadly air?
Now, what other details you want to share with our Facebook fans about the book? Anything I missed here?
I'm trying to think if there's anything you did a fantastic job covering on. You know, I think that what I love the most, I think, about the book is honestly some of the pictures I think are pretty great. And I love the cover, thank goodness.
Yeah, you gotta see the cover. Our audience.
You guys see? It's a little bright, sorry. It's fine. That's what you get for having a white cover. And I think that is what's that's so powerful about the story, and both of these stories is, like I said, coming back to the visuals, that's what always pulls me in. It's so funny. Into a book, you wouldn't really think that, but it's either the visuals in the book, actually the visuals, so like, you know, my visuals here, my photos here, or the visuals that I could just create in my head, because I'm such a kind of film person. So I think that's one of the things I enjoyed the most was picking the photos, which you don't always really get to do with a historical book. I mean, you know, we come down to sketches sometimes, and, you know, caricatures. There's certainly a certain time period where you're not able to get photos. And I was just so lucky that I had two subjects that were so visual. I mean, it's hard to you know, bones coming out of a garden and you know, fog creeping around very famous statues. And I'm a real Halloween person. I'm crazy about Halloween, love Halloween. So I was so thrilled that I could basically relive Halloween every day for 3 years writing this book. I had candles lit up everywhere in my office, and if I could have a gas lamp in every corner of my house, I would, because I love the atmosphere. So that's really what I was trying to just get in here, was that feeling of just kind of being cold but clammy, sweaty because you're scared. And there's a line in here that I think about sometimes, which is, you know, in a fog, if you're with someone you're in love with, you know, the fog is romantic. You're holding their hand and you feel safe and you can pull them close. But if you're by yourself and you're in a strange city, or your city is strange and scary, then the fog is a very different landscape.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because when you talked about that, I'm thinking of my husband, how I'd love that. And then I was thinking about being alone and how scary that would be.
It's vulnerable, very
yeah.
Not being able to see and hear and muffled. And I think it's like an animal. I think it's wonderful. And I love the fog. It's certainly my favorite sort of, weather time period is the fall.
Now, what books are you reading right now?
I'm in the middle of sorting out my second book, and so I've been poking around a little bit. I was just telling a friend of mine about a Mark Twain book that I liked a lot called Pudd'nhead Wilson. And I like to go back to the classics. I like complicated books. Pudd'nhead Wilson is an example of a pretty complicated book. And I like, of course, books that really make you feel uncomfortable and uneasy, and with its subject matter, and particularly with its politics and sort of analysis of human nature. And I think Mark Twain is pretty darn good at doing stuff like that. So I like to read Twain whenever I feel like I need to get a break from wacky serial killers and scary fog.
Now, do you have a favorite author? I know you mentioned an author earlier that you really admired.
Well, yeah, it's hard to beat Eric Larson. He's wonderful. I have quite a few, yeah. Douglas Preston is a fantastic author. Joe Drake. There are an awful lot that, I sort of follow, who I think, and they all have, to me, the same qualities. Just people who pull you in with characters, real characters, and who know how to evoke a feeling or a time period, or just drop you in and let you sit there, whether it's uncomfortable or not. And so I really gravitate towards people who write sort of in electric phrases that really excite me. I like finding a line that I read over and over and over again. I just keep thinking, I don't know if I could ever come up with something like that, but I'm so appreciative that they came up with that.
That's great. Well, I'm really excited to announce that we're going to be doing a book signing in Austin, and it's North Austin.
Yep, the North 183, so Research Boulevard, Costco, on October 29th, which is a Sunday, perfect time to go to Costco, and from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock. So please come in and come say hi and bring me some pecan pie. I know they have those really big ones, so.
And pumpkin.
And pumpkin pie.
Yes, very good. Yes, good. So that's going to be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And all your effort in this book, and it's really exciting that you're able to share and tell the story. And
thank you.
Yes.
I'm really happy to be at Costco, so thank you very much.
Yeah, so thanks. So we will be back live this coming Thursday evening. We're going to be at East Lansing in Michigan, and we're going to be doing a tour of our new Costco there.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to that.
Good. I bet the folks in East Lansing are too, aren't they?
Yes. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us.